Sarah stared at her laptop, the glow reflecting in her tired eyes. The clock ticked past midnight, each second pushing her closer to her deadline. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, racing to finish the last paragraph of her essay. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her, but she couldn't rest, not yet, not until this assignment was submitted. Finally, with a weary sigh, she typed the last word. She saved the document and leaned back, stretching her stiff muscles. For a moment, she simply sat in the quiet, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Her apartment was small, just a single room with a kitchenette and a bathroom, but it was hers. It was her sanctuary. Sarah decided to reward herself with a cup of hot chocolate. As she waited for the water to boil, she glanced out the window. It was a cool autumn night, the wind rustling the leaves outside. The streetlight cast long, eerie shadows across the deserted street below. Everything was still, quiet, except for the figure standing across the street. Sarah froze, her heart pounding in her chest. A tall, shadowy figure stood motionless beneath the streetlight, its features obscured by the darkness. She couldn't make out any details, just a silhouette against the pale glow. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched it, a shiver running down her spine. It was just standing there, unmoving, staring up at her window. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her, its unseen eyes boring into her. Fear tightened its grip on her, squeezing the air from her lungs. She took a step back from the window, her mind racing. Who could it be at this hour? What did they want? The questions swirled in her mind, fueling her growing panic. She had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed in her own home. The figure remained rooted to the spot, a silent, menacing sentinel. Sarah told herself it was nothing, just her imagination playing tricks on her. But deep down, a primal fear warned her that something was very, very wrong. Sarah tried to rationalize the figure away. It was probably just someone walking home late, she told herself, or maybe a neighbor taking out the trash. There was a logical explanation, she just had to find it. She forced herself to look away from the window, focusing on her breathing, in, out, in, out. Slowly, the pounding in her chest began to subside. She was being silly, letting her exhaustion get the better of her. There was nothing to be afraid of. She busied herself with making her hot chocolate, her back to the window. She wouldn't give the figure the satisfaction of seeing her fear. She would pretend it wasn't there, that it was all in her head. But even as she tried to convince herself, a nagging doubt lingered in the back of her mind. The figure had been so still, so purposeful in its stance. It hadn't moved a muscle, not even to glance away. It was like it was waiting for something. A sharp rap on the window made Sarah jump, spilling hot chocolate down her hand. She cried out, her heart leaping into her throat. She whirled around, her eyes wide with terror. The figure was gone. The street was empty, the only sound the wind whistling through the trees. Relief washed over Sarah, followed by a wave of dizziness. She leaned against the counter, her hand trembling as she wiped the spilled chocolate from her hand. It had been her imagination, just as she thought. Another knock, louder this time, shattered the silence. Sarah froze, her blood turning to ice. The knocking came again, insistent, urgent. It wasn't coming from the front door, it was coming from the window. Her window. Terror clawed its way up her throat, choking her. Her mind screamed at her to run, to hide, to do anything but what she was about to do. But she couldn't help herself. She had to see. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for her phone. The screen illuminated her pale face, reflecting the fear in her eyes. A text message from an unknown number blinked at her. "I see you," it read, the words sending chills down her spine. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against her bones. How was this possible? Who was sending her these messages? Her gaze darted back to the window, her breath catching in her throat. The knocking had stopped. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the room spinning. She leaned against the wall, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. Her phone slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor, the screen going dark. Fear, raw and primal, pulsed through her veins. She was trapped, hunted in her own home. The knocking resumed, more insistent now, demanding her attention. Each rap on the glass was like a hammer blow to her chest. Fear, sharp and cold, pierced her resolve. She had to see. She had to know. Slowly, her hand shaking so violently it was almost impossible to control, she reached out and grasped the edge of the curtain. Her breath hitched in her throat, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She closed her eyes tightly, bracing herself for whatever horror awaited her on the other side. Then, taking a deep breath, she yanked the curtain open. A pair of eyes, wide and gleaming with a terrifying intensity, stared back at her. A scream rose in her throat, but before she could unleash it, a pale hand slammed against the window, the fingers splayed across the glass. It was a face she knew.